Have you ever kept a journal? And did anyone ever read it without your permission?
I've swallowed a lot over the years, and when I say a lot, I mean decades of little cuts that never healed because every time I tried to talk about them, I was either told I was imagining things or that I should just be happy for my brother. And for a long time, I did what I thought was the right thing, kept my head down, stayed out of trouble, didn't demand attention, and told myself that maybe one day my parents would see me as more than just the kid who could handle herself. But here's the thing about always being the one who doesn't need anything, people start treating you like you don't matter. And my parents, whether they realized it or not, built their whole relationship with me on that assumption. When I got into grad school, I didn't even tell them right away, because I knew the news would be met with a polite congratulations and then followed by a long update about Jake's soccer stats. But when I told them about my graduation, I honestly thought maybe this would be different. This was not some high school award or some job promotion they could brush off. This was years of my life, sleepless nights, and a mountain of student debt finally paying off. I asked them to come. I gave them the date months in advance. I even reminded them the week before, and both of them said they wouldn't miss it for the world. My mom actually said, "We'll be there front row, cheering for you." And I believed her. Graduation day comes, and I wake up with that nervous, excited feeling in my chest, the one where you've worked so hard for something that you're almost afraid to enjoy it because it doesn't feel real yet. I check my phone and there's a missed call from my dad. I think maybe they're just calling to say they're on their way. I call back, and the second I hear his voice, I know something's wrong. He starts talking too casually, like he's trying to keep it light, and then he says, "Hey, so listen, Jake's got this huge game today. One of the scouts might be there, and we really think it's important to be there for him. We'll celebrate with you after." I don't even remember what I said in response. I know I was quiet for a long moment, and then I probably mumbled something like, "Okay," because that's what I always do. I make it easy for them to hurt me. I hung up and sat there in my gown, listening to people outside taking pictures with their families, and I realized that this was it for me. This was the last time I was going to let them push me to the back of the line in my own life. I walked across that stage alone, smiling for a camera that didn't have my parents behind it, and I told myself I would never forget how that felt. When the ceremony ended, my phone lit up with texts from them. "How did it go? We're so proud of you. Send pictures." I didn't respond. I wasn't angry in the screaming, throwing things away. I was angry in the cold, quiet way where you start thinking about every single time you've been made to feel like you were asking for too much when all you wanted was the bare minimum. They'd done this in small ways my whole life, skipping school plays for Jake's games, cutting vacations short because Jake had practice, rearranging holidays so they could take him to tournaments. But this was the one I couldn't brush off. The first day I ignored their calls. It was easy. The second day, a little harder because I'm wired to answer when they need me. But by the end of the week, I felt lighter. There was a freedom in not giving them instant access to my time and attention, and I think that's when the shift started. I didn't tell anyone in the family why I wasn't answering, because I wanted them to sit in that confusion. I wanted them to wonder. And judging by the increasing number of missed calls, they were wondering a lot. By the second week, the messages got sharper. "This is childish. We didn't mean to hurt you. You need to stop overreacting." It was fascinating to watch the tone change from concern to irritation, like my silence was somehow more offensive than their absence at one of the most important days of my life. And here's the thing, I didn't have a plan yet, not exactly. But the longer I stayed quiet, the more I realized that I didn't have to explain myself to them. I could decide what kind of access they had to me, and for the first time in my life, I could control the terms. Now, maybe you're wondering if I ever confronted them directly about skipping graduation. I didn't, not yet. Because when you call someone out too early, they get defensive, they twist it around, and you end up feeling like you're the one who needs to apologize. I wasn't going to give them that. Instead, I decided to wait, to let the silence build, to see what they'd do when they couldn't guilt-trip me over the phone. And oh, they did something. Something big. Something that told me exactly how much I was getting under their skin. They didn't just wait for me to call back. They didn't even just show up at my house. No, they came to my workplace. And they didn't come to talk quietly, either. If they thought I'd just get over it like every other time, they were about to learn how wrong they were. By the time that second week rolled into the third, I had settled into this strange rhythm of complete silence, and while part of me thought maybe they would eventually just give up and let it go, deep down I knew my parents were not the kind of people who could handle not being in control of a situation, especially when it came to me. They had spent my whole life dictating the terms of every interaction, when we spoke, what we spoke about, what counted as important, and what could be brushed off. So the idea that I had simply removed myself from that system must have felt to them like an insult they couldn't ignore. It wasn't even about love or family anymore. It was about the fact that I had dared to set a boundary without their permission. On a Wednesday morning, I was at my desk going through emails when the receptionist called to say my parents were in the lobby. My stomach dropped because I knew immediately this was not going to be one of those quiet, reasonable conversations you have in a corner. They hadn't announced they were coming, hadn't texted to ask if I was free, and they sure as hell weren't there to offer an apology. I could already picture the way my mom's voice would go sharp when she thought she was being disrespected, and my dad's habit of puffing himself up like he was the authority in any room he entered. When I stepped into the lobby, it was like walking straight into a stage scene. My mom was standing there with her arms crossed, and my dad was pacing like he was working himself up for a fight. Before I could even say hello, my mom launched into it, a full-volume tirade about how ridiculous I was being, how selfish it was to ignore family, how they had only missed the graduation because opportunities like Jake's don't come along every day, and I should be mature enough to understand that. I glanced around and realized the receptionist, a couple of my coworkers, and even a client waiting on the couch were all pretending to look at their phones while obviously listening. I didn't interrupt them. I didn't defend myself. I stood there and let them talk, because every word they said in that tone, in that place, in front of those people, was doing more damage to their own image than I could have ever done. I knew my parents valued appearances. In our small community, their reputation as wonderful, supportive parents was practically a trophy they polished daily. So the fact that they were now showing this side of themselves in public was like handing me a loaded weapon I didn't even have to fire. My dad eventually chimed in, raising his voice in that I'm not yelling way that's actually more condescending than just yelling, telling me I was acting like a spoiled child and that in their day, you didn't cut off family over small misunderstandings. I looked at him and thought about how many small misunderstandings I'd been told to swallow over the years, each one another brick in the wall they'd built to keep me in my place. And, maybe for the first time, I felt no guilt at all about the fact that I wasn't going to climb over that wall to meet them halfway. After several minutes of this one-sided performance, my mom finally ended with, "We are your parents, and you will not treat us like this." I just nodded once, said okay, and walked away. I didn't tell them to leave. I didn't make a scene. I simply turned my back and went into my office, closing the door behind me. My hands were shaking, not because I was scared, but because I knew they had just handed me something far more valuable than an apology. They had given me proof. Proof that their version of events, the one they liked to spread to the rest of the family, was not the truth. Proof that when they felt they were losing control of me, they would stoop to embarrassing themselves in public to try to get it back. They stormed out, and I could hear my dad muttering something under his breath as the door slammed. About 10 minutes later, one of my coworkers came in and said quietly, "Hey, you don't have to tell me what that was about, but whatever it is, you're not the crazy one here." And that, honestly, was the moment I realized just how much potential this situation had. Because if my parents wanted to paint me as the ungrateful daughter, they had just given me multiple witnesses to the fact that their behavior was anything but parental. That night, I didn't answer their calls. I didn't even listen to the voicemails. I just sat there thinking about how many people they cared about impressing, and how quickly those people's opinions could shift if they started to see cracks in the perfect family image. I wasn't interested in humiliating them for the sake of it, that wasn't the point, but I was starting to understand that the best revenge wouldn't be screaming at them or cutting them off entirely. The best revenge would be subtle, precise, and aimed exactly where it would hurt the most, their public persona and their golden child narrative about Jake. They had walked out of my workplace thinking they'd shamed me into calling them, thinking they'd forced me to bend. But what they didn't realize was that all they'd really done was hand me the exact leverage I needed to start dismantling the little kingdom they'd built for themselves. And I was going to take my time, because the slower it happened, the more it would sink in that they'd brought every bit of it on themselves. In the days after that little performance at my office, I noticed a shift in my own mindset that felt almost dangerous in the best possible way, because while for most of my life I had been operating from a place of trying to keep the peace, always smoothing over rough edges and cushioning blows so no one could accuse me of being the difficult one, I was suddenly free from that obligation, and it was as though I had finally been handed the keys to a door I had never dared to open. I realized that if my parents had shown up at my workplace thinking they could pressure me back into my old role, and if they had walked away believing they'd made some kind of power move, then they were living in a fantasy I had no intention of correcting. Because the truth was that they had just made themselves vulnerable in a way they had never been before. I began with something so small and subtle that no one could ever accuse me of stirring up trouble, because the beauty of the first move in a long game is that it's not supposed to look like a move at all. I started talking, not to them directly, but to the people who mattered to them: extended family members, family friends, old neighbors, people they saw at church, and the conversations were never framed as complaints or attacks. They were framed as casual updates about my life. If someone asked how graduation went, I would smile and say, "It was great. I'm so glad I went through with it even though my parents couldn't make it." And then I'd pause, just long enough for the other person to process that detail without me adding any bitterness or explanation, because I didn't need to. People are naturally curious, and in a community where gossip travels faster than truth, I knew the less I said, the more they would fill in the blanks on their own. Within a couple of weeks, I could tell the shift was happening. An aunt texted me out of the blue to say she was sorry she missed the ceremony and that she had no idea I'd gone alone. A family friend who had always been firmly in my parents' corner made an offhand comment about how Jake's games must be really something if they take priority over graduations. None of this was said directly to my parents in front of me, but I knew it was making its way back to them, because their calls and messages started to take on this clipped, defensive tone, as if they were trying to prove they weren't hearing what I knew they were hearing. The most satisfying part of this early stage was that I didn't have to fabricate a single thing. I simply told the truth in the right way, to the right people, at the right time. My parents had always been experts at controlling the narrative, making sure any less than flattering detail about our family life was buried under a pile of half-truths and distractions, but now they were up against something they couldn't easily rewrite. Because the facts were simple, I had invited them to graduation, they had promised to be there, and they had chosen Jake's game instead. That wasn't rumor. That wasn't my interpretation. That was reality, and the more it was repeated, the less room they had to spin it. Of course, I knew they would try. My mother's social media suddenly became a constant stream of pictures of her and Jake at his games, with captions about how family always supports each other no matter what, which was so transparent it was almost embarrassing. My dad started mentioning to anyone who would listen that Jake's career is taking off and we've had to make sacrifices to help him, conveniently lumping my graduation into the category of acceptable sacrifices. The thing they didn't understand was that the more they leaned into this narrative, the more obvious it became that they were trying to justify something they knew was wrong. The most interesting reaction came from Jake himself, who called me one night sounding half guilty and half annoyed, saying he'd heard some people talking and asking why I was making such a big deal out of a scheduling conflict. I told him calmly that it wasn't about that one day. It was about a lifetime of being the afterthought. He laughed it off and said I was being dramatic, which only confirmed for me that he was as comfortable on that pedestal as they were keeping him there. I hung up without arguing, because I didn't need him to understand. I needed him to stay exactly where he was, oblivious and confident, because that would make what came later all the more effective. By the end of the month, I could feel the tension radiating off my parents even without speaking to them. They had spent years building up this image of the perfect, united family with a star athlete son and a daughter who was successful but self-sufficient enough to not need their attention. And now there was a quiet little crack in that image that they couldn't patch over without admitting the truth. And here's the thing about cracks: once you see one, you start looking for more, and so do other people. It was like pulling a single loose thread from a sweater. The garment might still look intact for a while, but every tug makes it weaker, and eventually it's going to unravel whether you want it to or not. I wasn't in a rush. I had no intention of exploding the situation overnight, because I knew the slower it went, the more it would eat at them. Every awkward pause in a conversation, every sideways glance from a family friend, every time someone asked them about my graduation with that hint of judgment in their voice, all of it was another little reminder that they no longer had complete control. And as I sat there at my desk one evening, looking at a text from a cousin who said, "I don't know what happened, but I'm on your side," I realized something important. This wasn't just about getting even anymore. This was about shifting the balance of power so permanently that they would never again be able to treat me as the expendable child. The groundwork was laid, the first strike had landed, and the best part was that they didn't even know the real game had started yet. By the time a couple of more weeks had passed, the quiet little rumor I had let loose into our circle had grown legs of its own, moving into conversations I wasn't even present for, twisting its way into potlucks, after-church chats, and family barbecues, and while my parents tried desperately to act as if nothing had changed, it was obvious that they were feeling the weight of having to defend themselves in ways they had never had to before. I could hear it in my mother's voice the one time she accidentally left a voicemail while she was mid-conversation with someone else, the forced cheeriness barely masking the tension underneath as she explained for the 100th time that Jake's game was a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity, as if repetition could turn it into something noble. My father, on the other hand, seemed to have adopted the strategy of avoidance, carefully steering every conversation toward Jake's latest athletic achievements and away from any subject that could reopen the wound they were pretending wasn't there, which only made the absence of acknowledgement more glaring to anyone paying attention. It was around this time that an email landed in my inbox inviting me to speak at a local professional networking event, the kind that tends to draw small business owners, community leaders, and, importantly, many of the same people my parents like to keep in their orbit. The organizer had heard about my academic achievements through a mutual connection and thought my story might inspire younger attendees. I knew instantly this was not just an opportunity but a gift, because here was a stage being handed to me, not to air grievances, but to quietly plant seeds in exactly the kind of soil where they would grow into the most uncomfortable truths for my parents. When the night came, I stood on that stage and talked about resilience, hard work, and the way success can sometimes feel hollow when the people you love most don't show up for your milestones. I didn't mention my parents by name, and I didn't have to, because everyone in that room already knew exactly who I was talking about and exactly what event I was referring to. I told the story plainly, how I had invited my family to my graduation, how they had promised to be there, and how I had walked across that stage without them in the audience. I spoke without bitterness, without raising my voice, framing it instead as a turning point that taught me to be my own source of validation. The applause I got at the end was warm and genuine, but the real payoff came afterward, when several people approached me to say how much the story resonated with them and, in lower tones, to express how shocked they were that my parents had made that choice. The following week, Jake lost a sponsorship deal he had been banking on, one that was connected to a local business whose owner had been sitting in that audience. I didn't know for certain if my speech had influenced the decision, but I didn't need confirmation. The timing spoke for itself. My parents, of course, immediately started scrambling to figure out who was poisoning the well, because it couldn't possibly be their own actions that had shifted public perception. The idea that I might be moving the chess pieces without ever touching them directly would never occur to them, and I wasn't about to enlighten them. What struck me during this period was the growing sense of calm I felt in the face of their increasing agitation. For years, I had been the one on edge, always anticipating the next time I would be sidelined, the next excuse I'd have to swallow, but now the roles were reversing. They were the ones checking over their shoulders, wondering what people were saying, noticing that the smiles from acquaintances seemed a little tighter, the conversations a little shorter. It wasn't explosive enough to draw sympathy for them, but it was persistent enough to erode the easy confidence they'd always had in their social standing. Even Jake started to show signs that the constant pedestal he'd been standing on was beginning to wobble. When we crossed paths at a mutual friends gathering, he made a half-joking comment about how some people seemed to be rooting for him to fail lately. I just smiled and said, maybe they're just finally seeing the whole picture before walking away. His confusion in that moment was almost as satisfying as the speech itself, because it reminded me that the real victory here wasn't in loud declarations or public confrontations. It was in quietly shifting the ground under their feet until they realized they were no longer standing where they thought they were. The power dynamic between us had changed so gradually that I don't think they even understood when it officially tipped in my favor, but I could feel it. I no longer flinched when I saw their names pop up on my phone. I no longer braced myself for their disapproval. I no longer worried about how they might twist my words to fit their narrative. They could try, of course, but it would be like trying to tape over a leak that had already soaked through the wall. The damage was already done, and the truth was already out there. The best part was knowing that I still hadn't used the most potent card I was holding. Up until now, everything I had done was indirect, subtle, and deniable, a series of moves designed to make them feel the slow burn of losing control without ever giving them a single action they could point to as the cause. But I knew that if the right moment came, I would have the opportunity to make one move so clear, so undeniable, that it would leave no question about where the shift had come from. And as much as I wanted to savor the current stage of this little game, I could already see that moment on the horizon, waiting for me to step into it when the timing was perfect. They couldn't call me a liar without admitting exactly what they had done, and they couldn't stop the undercurrent of judgment flowing toward them without undoing years of their own favoritism, which was something I knew they would never do. That was the beauty of it. They had built the trap themselves. All I had done was quietly shut the door. It's strange how, when you've been carrying years of quiet resentment, the moment you finally see the perfect opportunity to turn all of it into something tangible, you feel less like you're about to lash out and more like you're about to complete a very long, very deliberate piece of work that has been sitting half-finished in your mind for as long as you can remember. That's exactly how it felt when the call came in from a former professor of mine who now worked with a youth mentorship program. She told me they had a promising young athlete who was applying for a spot on a semi-pro team, but he lacked the resources and networking to compete with kids who had the right connections, and she thought I might be able to help him prepare, given my background in both my field and the professional side of sports management. I didn't think much of it until she said the name of the team, and I realized, with almost cinematic clarity, that it was the very same team Jake had been preparing to try out for in just a few months. I didn't say anything to her about Jake. I didn't have to. Instead, I told her I'd be happy to help, and we set up a meeting with the kid. His name was Marcus, and from the moment we started talking, I could see how much raw potential he had, and also how much the lack of guidance and resources had held him back. He reminded me, in a way, of myself at his age, talented, motivated, but without the safety net of parents who would move mountains for him. I threw myself into helping him, not because I saw him as a pawn in some revenge plan, but because I genuinely wanted him to succeed, though I won't pretend I didn't see the parallel tracks forming. His rising confidence and skill set running right alongside the timeline of Jake's long-held expectation that he'd walk onto that team without much of a challenge. Over the next few months, I made sure Marcus had everything Jake had always taken for granted: access to the right training facilities, introductions to people in the industry who could open doors, and most importantly, the kind of strategic preparation that goes beyond just playing the sport well. I taught him how to handle interviews, how to present himself in a way that made scouts remember his name, and how to network without looking like he was trying too hard. I knew from years of watching Jake that these were the areas he tended to neglect because he'd always been able to rely on raw talent and parental hype to carry him through. When tryout day came, I didn't go to watch, because this was not about standing in the crowd to witness the moment. This was about knowing, without needing to see it, that the groundwork I had laid was about to pay off in a way that would be impossible for my parents to ignore. Sure enough, later that evening, I got a call from Marcus telling me, almost in disbelief, that he had been offered a spot. He was over the moon, and I was genuinely happy for him. I congratulated him, told him he'd earned every bit of it, and hung up knowing that the other shoe was about to drop in my family. It didn't take long. Less than 24 hours later, my phone lit up with my mother's name. I let it go to voicemail, but the message was exactly what I expected, tight, clipped, demanding to know if I had anything to do with what happened to Jake, as if a merit-based selection process could only have been rigged if he didn't win. When I didn't call back, my father followed up with a text full of half-accusations and the kind of veiled insults that are meant to sting, but mostly just confirm you've hit a nerve. I decided it was time to end the silence, not because I owed them an explanation, but because I wanted them to hear the truth directly from me, without the comfort of believing it had been twisted by gossip. When I finally called them, my voice was calm, measured, and entirely free of the emotional spikes they were probably hoping for. I told them that yes, I had mentored a young athlete, that he had worked hard and earned his place, and that I wasn't going to apologize for helping someone who reminded me of what it feels like to be overlooked. And then I told them something I had been holding back for years, that their decision to skip my graduation had simply been the final confirmation of a lifetime of choices that made it clear where I stood in their priorities, and that I had stopped expecting them to see me any differently a long time ago. My mother tried to interrupt, to say that they had done their best, that I was being unfair, but I didn't let her derail the point. I told them that family isn't just about blood, it's about showing up, and that they had taught me that lesson better than anyone, not by telling me, but by showing me exactly what happens when you don't. I said I wasn't interested in repairing the relationship on their terms anymore, because their terms had always meant sacrificing my own dignity, and I was done with that. There was a long pause after I finished, the kind that tells you the other person is scrambling for a way to reclaim control of the conversation and realizing they can't. My father finally muttered something about making a mistake and hoping we can move past this, but his voice had lost that usual authoritative edge. For the first time, I felt like they were the ones standing on unsteady ground, looking at me not as the daughter who would always come back no matter how many times they sidelined her, but as someone who had stepped completely out of their reach. I didn't hang up on them, but I didn't give them the satisfaction of ending on a reconciliatory note either. I simply said, "I wish you the best," and left it there, because I knew that those words, polite as they sounded, would carry the weight of the fact that I no longer needed them in any part of my life. They taught me that family doesn't always show up for you, and I returned the lesson in a way they would never forget. And as far as I'm concerned, that was the real win, not the satisfaction of revenge for one day, but the permanent shift in power that meant they could never again write me out of my own story.